You know, Smith, I was lying in bed last night unable to sleep because I kept thinking about how quickly time passes, and it suddenly hit me that we're approaching 2026, which feels both incredibly close and somehow distant at the same time. And I started wondering whether I'm actually making the most of my life, or just letting days slip by without real intention or purpose.
That's such a profound realization to have in the middle of the night, and I completely understand that feeling because I've experienced similar moments where I question whether the path I'm on is genuinely leading me toward the life I want to live, or whether I'm simply following some predetermined script that society or family expectations have written for me without my conscious participation.
Exactly. And that's precisely why I wanted to have this conversation with you today, because I think many of our listeners are probably experiencing these same feelings of uncertainty mixed with hope, wondering what concrete steps they should be taking right now to ensure that when 2026 arrives, they can look back and feel proud of the progress they've made rather than regretful about opportunities they let pass by.
Well, I'm really glad you brought this up as a topic for discussion, because talking about life planning and personal improvement is not only helpful for our own growth, but also gives our listeners practical vocabulary and expressions they can use when discussing their own goals and aspirations in English, which is ultimately what this podcast is all about: learning language through meaningful, real conversations.
So let's dive deep into this question together. What should we actually do? And what specific plans should we make to genuinely improve our lives before 2026 arrives?
I think we should start with the topic that occupies most of our waking hours, which is our careers and professional development. Because whether we love our jobs or merely tolerate them, the work we do significantly impacts not just our financial situation, but also our sense of identity, our daily happiness levels, and our overall life satisfaction.
That's a really important starting point. And when I think about my own career trajectory, I realize I've been somewhat on autopilot for the past few years, showing up to work and completing my tasks competently enough, but not really pushing myself to acquire new skills or seek out opportunities that might challenge me in ways that lead to genuine growth, rather than just comfortable stagnation.
I can definitely relate to that feeling of professional complacency, where you're not necessarily unhappy with your current situation, but you're also not excited about it either. And I've come to understand that before 2026 arrives, one of the most important things I need to do is honestly assess whether my current career path aligns with my long-term values and aspirations, or whether I'm simply staying put because change feels intimidating and uncertain.
So, what do you think are the specific actions we should be taking right now in terms of career development? Because I don't want to just have vague intentions about doing better or being more ambitious. I want concrete, actionable steps that I can start implementing immediately and track over the coming months.
Well, one thing I've been thinking about seriously is the importance of continuous learning and skill acquisition, because the professional landscape is changing so rapidly that the skills that made us competitive 5 years ago might not be sufficient for the opportunities that will emerge over the next few years. And if we're not actively learning and adapting, we risk becoming obsolete in our own fields.
That's such a crucial point, and it makes me think about how I should probably be dedicating at least 3 to 5 hours per week to learning something completely new, whether that's a technical skill related to my industry, a language that could open up international opportunities, or even soft skills like public speaking or leadership that could help me advance into positions with greater responsibility and impact.
And beyond just acquiring new skills, I think we also need to be more intentional about building professional relationships and expanding our networks, because opportunities often come not from what you know, but from who knows you and thinks of you when interesting positions or projects become available. Yet so many of us, myself included, tend to keep our heads down and focus only on our immediate work without cultivating those broader connections that could transform our careers.
You're absolutely right about networking. And I have to admit that it's something I've consistently neglected because it sometimes feels awkward or transactional. But I'm beginning to understand that genuine professional relationships built on mutual respect and shared interests aren't about using people, but rather about creating a community where everyone supports each other's growth and success.
Another aspect of career planning that I think deserves serious consideration before 2026 is whether we should be thinking about diversifying our income streams rather than relying entirely on a single employer, because economic uncertainty is a reality we all face, and having multiple sources of income, whether through freelance work, consulting, creating digital products, or building a side business, can provide not just financial security, but also creative fulfillment and the freedom to take more risks with our primary career.
That's actually something I've been contemplating quite seriously lately. This idea of not putting all my professional eggs in one basket. And while the thought of managing multiple projects alongside my main job sounds exhausting on the surface, I'm also aware that many successful people have built their careers gradually by starting small side projects that eventually grew into significant opportunities they never could have predicted at the beginning.
Now, while career development is undeniably important, I think we'd be missing a crucial piece of the puzzle if we didn't talk about health and wellness, because all the professional success in the world becomes meaningless if we've sacrificed our physical and mental health to achieve it. And I've seen too many people reach their career goals only to realize they've destroyed their bodies and spirits in the process.
I couldn't agree more strongly with that observation. And if I'm being completely honest with myself, my health and wellness have taken a back seat to my work commitments far too often, manifesting in irregular sleep patterns, poor eating habits driven by convenience rather than nutrition, and an exercise routine that's virtually non-existent, despite my repeated promises to myself that I'll start going to the gym next week.
It's remarkably easy to fall into that pattern where we tell ourselves that we'll focus on health once we're less busy, once we've completed this project, once we've reached that promotion. But the truth that took me years to accept is that there will never be a perfect time when everything else is settled and we can finally prioritize our well-being. We have to make it a priority right now, in the midst of all the other demands on our time and energy.
So, what would a realistic, sustainable health improvement plan look like for someone who's currently doing basically nothing in terms of exercise and proper self-care? Because I don't want to set myself up for failure by creating some elaborate fitness program that I'll abandon after 2 weeks when the initial motivation inevitably fades and reality sets in.
I think the key is to start with such small, manageable changes that it feels almost absurd how easy they are. Because the goal isn't to transform your entire life overnight, but rather to build sustainable habits that gradually accumulate into significant improvements. Something as simple as a 15-minute walk every morning, or replacing one unhealthy snack with a piece of fruit, or going to bed 30 minutes earlier than usual can serve as the foundation upon which you build more ambitious health practices.
That makes so much sense. And it reminds me of something I read about how the most successful long-term health transformations don't come from drastic, dramatic overhauls that make great before and after social media posts, but rather from modest, consistent changes that people can maintain indefinitely because they're not exhausting or miserable to sustain.
Exactly. And I think before 2026 arrives, one of my primary goals needs to be establishing what I call non-negotiable health practices. Those baseline behaviors that I commit to doing every single day, regardless of how busy I am or how much I don't feel like it, much like brushing my teeth is non-negotiable even when I'm exhausted.
I really like that concept of non-negotiables. And for me, I think those need to include getting at least 7 hours of sleep per night, rather than the 5 or 6 I typically manage. Drinking enough water throughout the day instead of surviving primarily on coffee and tea, and building some form of physical movement into my daily routine, even if it's just stretching or a short walk, rather than nothing at all.
Mental health is another aspect that I believe deserves equal attention to physical health, yet it's something that many of us, particularly men, have been conditioned to ignore or minimize, acting as if stress, anxiety, and emotional exhaustion are just normal parts of modern life that we should simply push through rather than legitimate health concerns that deserve care and attention.
That's such an important point to emphasize, because I've noticed in my own life that when I neglect my mental and emotional well-being, by not taking time to process my feelings, not setting appropriate boundaries with work and social obligations, and not engaging in activities that genuinely bring me joy and relaxation, everything else in my life suffers. My work quality decreases, my relationships become strained, and my physical health deteriorates as stress manifests in various unpleasant symptoms.
So perhaps one of the most valuable things we could commit to before 2026 is developing a regular practice of mental health maintenance, whether that takes the form of meditation, therapy, journaling, spending time in nature, engaging in creative hobbies, or simply scheduling regular periods of complete disconnection from work and technology where we can just exist without any demands on our attention or energy.
Now I want to address something that makes many people uncomfortable to discuss, but is absolutely essential to our long-term well-being and freedom, which is our financial situation, and the specific plans we need to make regarding money management, savings, investments, and building the kind of financial security that allows us to make choices based on what we want rather than what we can afford.
Money is indeed one of those topics that people often avoid in polite conversation, treating it as somehow inappropriate or crass to discuss openly. Yet financial stress is one of the leading causes of anxiety, relationship problems, and limited life choices. So pretending that money doesn't matter or that focusing on it makes us materialistic is actually doing ourselves a tremendous disservice.
I've been guilty of having what I'd call a head in the sand approach to my finances, where I generally know how much money is coming in and roughly how much is going out, but I don't have detailed knowledge of my spending patterns. I don't have a structured budget that I actually follow, and I definitely don't have a clear financial plan with specific savings goals and investment strategies that will help me build wealth over time rather than just maintaining my current lifestyle indefinitely.
That's actually a more common situation than you might think, because financial literacy isn't something most of us were taught in school, and there's something psychologically challenging about confronting the reality of our financial situation when we suspect we might not like what we discover. But I've come to realize that ignorance in this area isn't bliss. It's just anxiety we're postponing until it becomes a crisis we can no longer avoid.
So, what would you say are the most important financial steps that someone in their late 20s or 30s should be taking right now to set themselves up for long term security and freedom? Keeping in mind that many of us don't have huge incomes or family wealth to fall back on and are essentially starting from scratch with whatever we can save from our regular paychecks.
The first and most fundamental step, though it might sound boring and unexciting, is to create and actually stick to a realistic budget that tracks every single dollar you earn and spend. Because you absolutely cannot make informed financial decisions or set meaningful goals if you don't know where your money is currently going. And I promise you'll be surprised by how much you spend in categories you didn't even realize were significant drains on your resources.
I've tried budgeting apps before, but always abandoned them after a few weeks because entering every transaction felt tedious and time consuming. Yet I know that's probably just an excuse, and what I really need is to commit to the process for at least 3 months until it becomes habitual rather than giving up at the first sign of inconvenience.
Beyond budgeting, I think one of the smartest financial moves we can make before 2026 is to build what personal finance experts call an emergency fund, essentially 3 to 6 months of living expenses kept in an easily accessible savings account. Because having that financial cushion transforms your entire relationship with risk and opportunity, allowing you to leave a toxic job, pursue a career change, or handle unexpected expenses without going into debt or experiencing panic.
That makes perfect sense intellectually. But I have to admit that when I think about actually accumulating 3 to 6 months of expenses in savings, the number feels so large and the task so daunting that I don't even know where to begin. Especially when I'm already living basically paycheck to paycheck with very little left over at the end of each month.
I understand that feeling completely, but here's the thing. You don't have to save 6 months of expenses all at once. You start with $100, then build to $500, then $1,000, celebrating each milestone along the way. And even having just $1,000 in emergency savings will dramatically reduce your financial stress because you'll know you can handle most minor emergencies without resorting to credit cards or loans.
Another financial topic that I know I should be paying attention to but have been avoiding out of a combination of ignorance and intimidation is investing and building long-term wealth through things like retirement accounts, index funds, and other investment vehicles that I honestly don't fully understand, but recognize are probably essential for anyone who doesn't want to work until they're 70, or rely entirely on government pension systems that might not even exist in their current form by the time we retire.
Investment can definitely seem overwhelming when you're first starting out, especially with all the jargon and complexity that the financial industry seems to deliberately cultivate. But the truth is that for most people, investing doesn't need to be complicated. Starting with your employer's retirement plan if they offer one, especially if they match contributions, which is literally free money you're leaving on the table if you don't participate, is probably the single best first step anyone can take.
And I suppose the earlier we start investing, even if it's just small amounts, the more time compound interest has to work its magic and turn modest regular contributions into substantial wealth over decades, which means that the money I invest in my 30s will ultimately be worth far more than money I invest in my 40s or 50s simply because it has more time to grow.
Absolutely. And that's why, despite all the other pressing financial concerns and tempting purchases we might want to make, prioritizing even small regular investments starting right now, rather than waiting until we have extra money or until we're more established, is probably one of the most impactful financial decisions we can make before 2026 arrives. and another year of potential compound growth passes us by.
You know, Smith, we've covered career, health, and finances. But I think there's another dimension of life improvement that's equally important yet often overlooked in our achievement-focused culture, which is the quality of our relationships. Not just romantic partnerships, but also friendships, family connections, and our relationship with ourselves. Because I've observed that many successful people reach their goals only to discover they're fundamentally lonely and disconnected, because they sacrificed relationships for accomplishments.
That's such a profound and often neglected truth, and I've definitely been guilty of treating relationships as something that will naturally maintain themselves without effort, while I focus my active attention on work and other goals. But the reality I'm coming to understand is that meaningful relationships require consistent investment, vulnerability, and presence in ways that our busy, distracted modern lives make increasingly difficult to provide.
I'm curious about what specific changes or commitments you think we should be making in the realm of relationships before 2026. Because it's easy to say, I should be a better friend, or I should spend more quality time with family, but those vague intentions rarely translate into actual behavior change unless we get much more concrete about what we're actually going to do differently.
Well, one thing I've been thinking about seriously is the need to schedule and protect time for important relationships with the same rigor I apply to work meetings and professional commitments. Because what tends to happen is that I tell myself I'll connect with friends and family when I have time. But since I never have time unless I deliberately create it, weeks or months pass without meaningful contact, and those relationships gradually erode through neglect.
That resonates deeply with me, and I've noticed a pattern where I'll go months without seeing close friends because we're all busy and meaning to get together. And then when we finally do reconnect, it feels slightly awkward because so much time has passed and we've each lived whole chapters of our lives that the other person wasn't present for, which creates this subtle but real distance that wouldn't exist if we'd maintained more regular contact.
And beyond just the frequency of contact, I think the quality of our interactions matters enormously. It's not enough to just be physically present with someone while we're mentally elsewhere, checking our phones every few minutes or thinking about work problems instead of genuinely listening and engaging with the person in front of us. And before 2026, I want to develop the capacity for what I'd call undivided presence, where when I'm with someone, I'm truly with them rather than perpetually half distracted.
I love that concept of undivided presence, and it makes me think about how much of my time with others is actually spent in this weird half-present state where I'm technically there, but not really fully engaged, and how much richer and more meaningful my relationships would be if I could learn to silence the constant background noise of my mind and just be completely present for the people I care about.
Another relationship aspect I think deserves attention is the question of whether we're surrounding ourselves with people who genuinely support our growth and challenge us to be better, or whether we're maintaining relationships primarily out of habit, convenience, or fear of loneliness, even when those connections no longer serve us or actively hold us back from becoming who we want to be.
That's a delicate topic because nobody wants to sound callous or calculating about relationships. But I do think there's wisdom in periodically evaluating whether the people we're investing time and energy in are relationships that add value to our lives and theirs in reciprocal ways, or whether some connections have perhaps run their natural course and continuing to force them is actually preventing both people from finding more aligned friendships.
And then there's perhaps the most important relationship of all, which is the one we have with ourselves. How we talk to ourselves internally, whether we treat ourselves with compassion or harsh criticism, whether we honor our own needs and boundaries or constantly sacrifice them for others, whether we actually know who we are beneath all the roles we play and expectations we're trying to meet.
Self-relationship is something I struggle with considerably because I've spent so much of my life defining myself through external validation, achievement at work, approval from others, meeting standards that I didn't even consciously choose for myself. And I'm realizing that before 2026 arrives, I need to do some serious inner work to understand what I actually value. What brings me genuine joy versus what I think should bring me joy, and who I am when nobody's watching or judging.
That kind of self-exploration and inner work is challenging because it requires us to sit with uncomfortable questions and possibly discover things about ourselves that contradict the narrative we've constructed. But I believe it's absolutely essential foundation work that needs to happen before we can make truly authentic choices about any other aspect of our lives.
Something else I want to discuss before we wrap up is the concept of lifelong learning and personal skill development, because I have this nagging feeling that I stopped really learning and growing intellectually after I finished formal education, and now I mostly just apply the knowledge and skills I already have, rather than actively expanding my capabilities in meaningful ways.
I share that concern, and I think it's a common trap that many of us fall into where we reach a certain level of competence in our field, become comfortable with what we know, and then spend years or even decades essentially repeating the same year of experience over and over, rather than continuously evolving and expanding our understanding of the world.
So, what would a meaningful learning plan look like for someone who's no longer in school but recognizes the importance of continued intellectual growth? Keeping in mind that most of us don't have unlimited time or money to spend on formal education programs and need to find ways to learn that fit realistically into our existing lives.
I think the key is to reframe learning as something that doesn't require traditional classroom settings or expensive degree programs, and instead recognize that we're living in an unprecedented era where knowledge is more accessible than ever through online courses, podcasts, books, YouTube videos, and countless other resources, most of which are either free or remarkably inexpensive compared to traditional education.
That's true. And yet, despite having access to virtually unlimited educational content, I find that I rarely take advantage of it in any systematic way, instead defaulting to mindless entertainment during my free time because learning requires mental energy and focus that feels difficult to muster after a long day of work.
Which is why I think before 2026, we need to establish what I'd call learning rituals, specific times and contexts where learning becomes habitual rather than something we do only when we happen to feel motivated, such as listening to educational podcasts during your commute, reading for 30 minutes before bed, or dedicating Saturday mornings to an online course you're working through systematically.
I really like that approach of embedding learning into existing routines, rather than treating it as a separate activity that requires finding additional time in an already full schedule. And I think if I could commit to just one educational podcast during my daily commute and one substantial book per month, that alone would represent hundreds of hours of learning annually that I'm currently wasting on mindless social media scrolling or spacing out.
And beyond just consuming information, I think we should also be developing practical skills that might not relate directly to our careers, but enrich our lives in other ways. whether that's learning a musical instrument, mastering a new language, developing cooking abilities, acquiring basic home repair skills, or any other capability that increases our self-sufficiency and gives us a sense of accomplishment and growth.
As we come to the end of this conversation, Smith, I'm feeling both inspired by all the possibilities we've discussed and slightly overwhelmed by how many areas of life need attention and improvement, which makes me wonder how we're supposed to actually make progress on all these fronts simultaneously without burning out or spreading ourselves so thin that we make no real progress on anything.
That's a completely valid concern, and I think the answer is that we probably can't do everything at once, which means we need to prioritize ruthlessly and accept that some areas will need to wait while we focus intensively on others, rather than trying to improve everything simultaneously in superficial ways that don't create lasting change.
So maybe what we each need to do is select 2 or 3 specific focus areas for the period between now and 2026, recognizing that we can't completely neglect the other areas, but also acknowledging that our active attention and effort will be concentrated on those priorities we've chosen as most important for this particular phase of our lives.
I think that's a much more realistic and sustainable approach. And for me personally, as I reflect on this conversation, I believe my top priorities need to be establishing consistent health practices because I've neglected physical wellness for too long. Developing a proper financial plan and emergency fund because that's causing me underlying anxiety even when I'm not consciously thinking about it. And being more intentional about relationship maintenance because I've let too many meaningful connections fade through simple neglect.
Those sound like excellent choices that address fundamental aspects of well-being. And for my part, I think I need to focus on career skill development because I'm at a point where I either need to actively invest in growing or risk becoming stagnant. Mental health practices because I've been running on stress and caffeine for too long without real recovery, and self-exploration work because I've realized I don't actually know myself as well as I thought I did.
And I think what's important to remember as we close this conversation is that improvement isn't about achieving perfection or completely transforming overnight into ideal versions of ourselves, but rather about making consistent, incremental progress in directions that align with our values and the lives we want to be living when 2026 arrives, and we look back on this period.
Absolutely. And I hope our listeners feel inspired rather than overwhelmed by this discussion, recognizing that wherever they are right now is okay, and that even small steps taken consistently in the right direction will compound into significant changes over time, just as small neglects compound into serious problems if left unaddressed.
Well, this has been a deeply meaningful conversation for me, Molika, and I'm grateful we took the time to think through these questions together because I think I have much more clarity now about what I need to focus on and why it matters.
I feel exactly the same way, Smith, and I'm excited to revisit this conversation in a year or so to see what progress we've made and how our thinking has evolved based on actually trying to implement these changes in our real lives rather than just discussing them theoretically.
That's a wonderful idea. An accountability conversation where we check in on whether we've actually followed through on these intentions or whether they remained just that. Good intentions without action.
So, to all our listeners, thank you so much for joining us for this extended, thoughtful discussion about life planning and improvement before 2026 arrives, and we hope it sparked some reflection about your own goals and priorities.
Please share in the comments what areas of life you're planning to focus on improving, what your biggest challenges are, and what specific steps you're committing to taking. We'd love to hear from you and learn from your perspectives as well.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and remember that the best time to start improving your life was yesterday, but the second best time is right now.
Take care, everyone, and we'll talk to you soon.